is the people who supervised me early on. It's almost a bit of an object relations dynamic where you sort of internalize your past supervisors, and so kind of keeping that in mind as I'm thinking about my own model.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? So mental models can both provide us with great resources for supervision. It can also create challenging interactions. So if our mental model of supervision is, I am the expert and you are the learner, then the interaction becomes about you teaching the student something as opposed to it being that exchange that was talked about just a couple seconds ago. And that sometimes means that in the context of identity, that if students come to us and say, hey, I've had this experience as a student of color trying to work with white clients that feels really problematic, and I think there's racism going on, and your experience hasn't been that, you might say, well, I've been working in this organization for 25 years, and I've never seen our clients do that, or I haven't heard that from them. That then feels like it's a challenging of that student's experience rooted in their identity that creates some difficulty in terms of how they feel seen and heard in that space. And it can be the opposite, where we can be really interested in hearing about those experiences and open to questioning some of what our mental models might have been previously about our client population, for example. So there's a both and there in terms of how our mental models can either facilitate the process or make the process more challenging. And so we're going to share a little bit about our mental models of supervision, just to give you some examples of how that can help or hinder us in the process of supervision. No, go ahead.
So I think for me, one of the things that best describes my mental model of supervision is that I come into the process thinking about my identities. And I have to recognize that that also can be something that's of a difference, to where not everyone thinks of their identities for various reasons, and that can create sometimes discrepancies in how we're actually having that exchange. Because my mental model is rooted in one area, versus where students or other people could be wanting more structured, formalized ways, where I come from that relational dynamic and supervision. I give the example of the class of suicide. So our students are really thinking about their mental model about suicide intervention. And for some of them, their mental model is, give me a tool so I can do the tool to create a risk assessment. That's part of the process, but that's actually, there's more to it. So it's hard, we're giving them critical thinking steps to think about how they're part of that tool, not just the checklist. And so that mental model is that I have to have something in order for the process to be done, but it's actually more so about how am I part of the process. So one of my other areas of the mental model for supervision is, as much as the word, I can't think of a different word, but the gatekeeping idea of supervision. So yes, there is an inherent responsibility for us to think about, people's safety, right? Whether it's the client's safety that they're interacting with, but also their own safety, the person's safety, in terms of being able to do this work effectively. I have to challenge some of those thoughts in my mental model, because I have to remember that supervision in my context is not actually providing any type of clinical therapy. It's different than mentorship, because there is inherent power in the relationship that I have to name and actually articulate and interact with. And it's not consultation, because we are evaluating them in some capacity. So those are my mental model frameworks for how I think about supervision, and sometimes I do a good job of going to them and thinking about how this might create discrepancy and how that exchange is happening. And other times I have to think about when it's already been done, and I have to come back in terms of talking about it.
And for me, I think a lot about my identities as well, mostly in the context of how my privilege informs how I assess somebody's work. So in my experience, speaking back to what Denise was talking about, my experience of my supervisors was that they weren't very thoughtful of their identity as white people, and so therefore they sort of marginalized and discounted the people of color that they supervised and how they contributed to our work. And so as a result of that, my model of supervision is to be really thoughtful about, how do I define success, and what do I think good work looks like, and how is that informed by my white identity and my connection to white dominant culture, and how does that look in the context of supervising students of color who might move through the world differently than I do, may have different ways of building relationships or producing content or writing documents or talking about story, et cetera, that's equally valid to the way that I work, but might look very different from the way that I would produce something. And so for me, being very critical of how my own mental model is shaped by dominant narratives about what work looks like has been really helpful in breaking down some of the barriers that I think has created an organizational structure around how folks from marginalized identities are seen as either being positive contributors to the work or not, and have enough experience with that in my life where I've seen challenges around that interaction in particular. So we want to continue to move because we know we don't have enough time to touch on everything. The one thing I did want to mention is that I think age is often a factor in supervision, and I think it can be at multiple levels where sometimes we think just because we're older, we have more experience and therefore more knowledge, or we might think that just because we're younger, we have more energy or excitement or whatever. And so those dynamics play out really often in supervision, and I think being really thoughtful about
all in different spots about this content. Not to mention, we're also in different spots about this content, just given the landscape and where we're at right now. So just being thoughtful and respectful in these processes that, you know, with or without that, this is an activity that will hopefully cause us to react in a way to think about how we can do this better.
Do you want to say where we want to go logistically?
So I think we'll have the caucus for those who identify as people of color in this corner over here, and then I think we'll just kind of see how it breaks out.
Okay, and so we're going to kind of try to create as much space in this room as possible, and we know that it might be a little bit loud, so if it turns out that that's not going to work, we'll figure something out, but for now, we're going to try to keep folks in the same place and because we're going to be doing some like individual work and some small conversations as opposed to large group discussion. So, so go ahead, and if you can go where you feel like you identify, we will talk about the process because it's going to feel weird. So we'll just acknowledge that, and we will talk about why it feels weird and have some different discussions about people's reactions to this actual practice of caucusing. So if you identify as somebody who is white, you will go to the sort of front left part of the room, and if you identify as somebody who is a person of color, you can go to the right. And again, like you're able to decide in this moment what feels most relevant to you. Understanding their identities are often very complex.